Firstly, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country on which this work was undertaken. So, our group travelled from Tübingen in southern Germany over the world to the other side of the planet. Firstly, we flew into Melbourne and then we went over into the Corangamite region of Western Victoria, which is about 150 kilometres to the southwest of Melbourne. Here you can see the beautiful setting of our field accommodation. Here we were in the so-called Monash hut of the grounds of one of the long-term farms in the area. And here you can see the outbuildings of the homestead and the homestead itself. Now this is in the Corangamite region, which is a cluster of lakes located in the Western Victorian volcanic fields. Here we are, packed and ready for field work. So firstly, we wanted to get an overview of the region, so we went up to the top of the Red Hills, which is a cluster of volcanoes which erupted a couple of thousand years ago. Now our first site was Lake Merdijuk, which is at the eastern edge of the Corangamite Lakes. And we were particularly interested in its lunette, the name that we give for the shoreline dune on the downwind or eastern side of the lake. And we're interested in looking at the sediments within this lunette, which can give us information about lake filling and drying through time. So as I mentioned, we're in the Western Victorian volcanic fields, so we do see pillow basalts protruding into the lake floor here and there. We were also interested in collecting water samples from the various lakes in order to get an idea of the water chemistry, which can also give us environmental information. So here's Dr. Monika Markowska taking some samples from Lake Merdijuk, which was a rather cold activity in the middle of winter in Australia. It's important to make sure that you filter out any organisms which might be living in the lake, as well as any suspended sediment, in order to get the pure water sample for chemical analysis in the laboratory. And we also collected sediments from sand dunes which extended downwind of the lake at Lake Merdijuk. And we collected samples from pits as well as using augers, which is kind of a hand drilling machine, which we can use to get out little vertical bites of about 20 centimeters in each go. And we can take a look at those sediments and make notes about them and get information about past environmental change as well as dating samples. And we also visited Lake Biak, which is in the centre of the Corangamite region. Now this is a curiosity because it's one of the very few areas in the world where dolomite is actively forming in the present day. Another exciting thing that we observed was clay pellets, which were blowing downwind and along the shoreline of the lake, as well as a huge graveyard of ostracod tests, which are organisms which live within the lake. Now we also visited Thunder Point near the city of Warrnambool. This is a locality that's interesting for us to explore how wind regimes have changed since the last ice age and a bit before, about 20,000 years ago. Now this site is full of coastal sand dunes. It's on the coast, so these dunes are blown by the wind, but it also contains a layer of volcanic material from Tower Hill, which is a volcano about 16 kilometres to the northwest, which erupted catastrophically about 34,000 years ago. So at Thunder Point, we have dune sediments which give us information about environmental change both before and after the eruption. So here you can see some of the dune sediments which are sitting on top of that volcanic material. And all of these white root-looking features are actually elements of ancient soils, which are basically precipitates of calcium carbonate, which form around the outside of vegetation roots. So this gives us information about the fact that we had quite a lot of vegetation cover at various places at times in the past. We've also got some calcium carbonate nodules here, which give us additional information about the chemistry and soil formation in the past. And here is the the volcanic layer, which relates to that eruption 34,000 years ago from Tower Hill. We took a walk through this dune environment. You can see there are a number of hazards which we're warned about, in order to get a better idea about the nature of sediment deposition in this area. And here we've got a couple of examples of the local vegetation, which is a heathy sort of vegetation, which is well adapted to the very windy coastlines, exposed to the westerly winds which we get along the coast here. It is a beautiful place to work and an enormous privilege to be able to work here. You can get some impressions of these beautiful landscapes. And here you can see that layer of volcanic material, below which we took a couple of very small samples in order to get information about the environmental conditions. And here is a tube for luminescence dating. So this is dating when the sediments were deposited, as well as a layer of the volcanic material and some of the local vegetation again. We also visited Tower Hill itself in order to get an overview of what the volcanic environment looked like, and from which we were able to get some samples from the lakes which are infilling the crater, from some colleagues which were collected some decades ago from colleagues at Monash University in Melbourne. And while we were there, we were really lucky to be able to see some local koalas. We also visited Spring Creek. This is another interesting site further north, and it was part of our field campaign because in previous work there we'd found wind-blown sand in the creek bed. Now this was unexpected because Spring Creek is in an entirely volcanic area where we wouldn't expect sand, so it must have been pretty windy. We sampled the sediments here in order to find out when the sand blew in and what it was made out of. We then moved to the Garryword mountain ranges further to the north and west. Now, the surrounding these mountains are a number of lake basins, which are nowadays mostly dry. We visited 3 of these lake basins to the east, south and west in order to sample the lake shorelines and investigate the history of lake filling and drying around the mountain range. The first place we visited was Bryant's Swamp, which is in the southern part of Garryword. Now, at the time, this was a very wet year in the winter of 2023, so it was pretty soggy, but it's not always like this. It was fascinating to see such wet conditions after a very, very long period of drought. Now what we're looking at here is one of the lunettes, one of these shoreline dunes at the southern end of Bryant Swamp. And this particular lunette here is about 3 meters high and extends to the north-south, in north-south direction to the east of the lake. Now, sampling involves digging a small pit in order to investigate the sediments in the uppermost metre or so of the lunette. We try and keep our pits as small as possible, but big enough to be able to sample and to be able to observe and make notes about the sediments in the lunette. In addition, we collected some more sediments from using the auger, so using this little analog drilling machine. And as I mentioned before, it collects samples or sediments in about 20 centimetres of vertical material, which we can then put in small piles and document for information about the kinds of sediments which we see in there and the kind of information about environmental conditions through time. This is Felix Lower, who is our colleague from the University of Melbourne, who was assisting us with the fieldwork. And if you look carefully here, you will see that there is some colour change in the sediments here, which might give us some information about environmental change through time as those sandy layers are deposited on top of each other. It's really important when you're collecting samples like this that you document very carefully what you're observing and label all of your sediment samples very carefully. While we were working at Bryant Swamp, we had some visitors. So we had a large mob of about 100 kangaroos come and visit us. They weren't too concerned. They hopped towards us, hopped past us, looped around, came back again. It was a fun experience. Here we are a little bit further north, also along Bryant Swamp, and this is another lunette, another one of these shoreline dunes, which was exposed in a road cutting, which made it very easy for us to observe what was going on in the sediments and to collect samples. So what we can see here is some nice pale sand, very typical for these sorts of lunettes in this area, but you can also see a layer at the top here, which is kind of black. Now this is a basalt. Now we're really confused, but also quite challenged about and excited about seeing this, where it must have come from one of the nearby volcanic eruptions. Now when we're looking at these lunettes, we're interested in how they relate to one another in time as well as in space. Now that spatial component is important to undertake some topographic transects. And here we're using an RTK GPS system, which is nicely accurate and precise, and that's particularly useful in areas where we've got very low lunette dunes, which may only be 1 or 2 meters high. We also saw a bit of local wildlife again. A frog decided to come and watch what we were doing and then hopped away into the grass. So returning to the Garryword region, we went further to the north and to the west to Lake Tolondo. Lake Tolondo is nowadays a water reservoir, so it has water being diverted actively into it. It does have 3 nested lunette dunes, which suggest that there was a change in lake filling and drying and different phases of lake filling and drying in the past. There's also a lot of waterbird life, so here we had some pelicans flying over Lake Tolondo while we were doing our sampling, which was pretty neat. Again, our sampling involved digging some small pits and looking at the samples which came out of the auger. Some of the tracks around this area were a bit challenging to drive on, but as you can see, we did pretty well with our 4-wheel drive. This is another one of the lunettes around Lake Tolondo. This is further to the south, and this particular lunette is quite a tall one, not that you can necessarily see it in this imagery. And this open forest is quite common around this area. The bracken loves the sandy soil, as do the banksia bushes, which you can see here. This is Victoria Schwartz digging one of the holes for her master's project to take a look at the sediments again. And once again, we did the same thing. We dug a small pit, observed the sediments and sampled the sediments from there. Here is a banksia flower. And we did that in parallel with an auger sampling. Here's some pink heath, which loves the sandy soil. And some sundews also growing on the sandy surface. Now we try and limit our environmental impact, so we keep our holes and our auger holes pretty as small as possible, just enough in order to be able to observe the changes in the sediments down into the pit, and the same thing with the auger hole. And of course we fill in those holes again so that there's no trace of the field work that we've been doing, and no trace of the sampling that we've been doing either. We had a few adventures working out in Western Victoria. So here we have a few cattle on the road. They didn't really want to move for us. Eventually they did. And driving from one site to the other, we occasionally had to drive through Garryword National Park, which is an incredibly beautiful place. And while we were in Garryword National Park, we decided to take a look at some of the source sediments, the sandstones, which make up the mountain range that is Garryword. And to get some idea of what the source sediment is, which is eventually draining down into the lakes around the margins of the mountain range. So here are some of those lovely sandstone formations. This is Stony Creek, which is one of the small channels which flows through the ranges and then eventually goes into the Wimmera River. There's quite a lot of tannins in the water. You can see this brownish colour. This is coming from the vegetation, from the oils and things in the vegetation. While we were there, we also visited Bunjil Shelter. So Bunjil's Cave is an ancient Aboriginal rock shelter which has art depicting Bunjil, one of the main dreaming beings of southeastern Australia, and his two dingoes. This is actually a site in the Black Range, so somewhat to the east of Garryword, but it's a very special site. And the geology here is a little different. We're looking at granites, in fact. Now, on one of our lunch breaks, we encountered a kookaburra and a currawong, both of whom decided to be a little bit cheeky fella and steal our lunch. There's that currawong nipping in to get some of Felix's pie. And some vanilla slice for the kookaburra. So a few further impressions of our fieldwork. Here is the full moon rising over the Victoria Range. This is Nakia, a site that we sampled on the eastern side of Garryword, and you can see here some of the traces of human occupation which stretch back for millennia, many millennia, and you can see just what a beautiful place this is. And it's no wonder that people have called this place home for so many millennia. East Basin Lake was one of the lakes that we visited in the Corangamite region. We also went to the Narracourt Caves, which is in South Australia, further to the west. This is a World Heritage Area, and it's a spectacular system of caves from which we can hopefully work with colleagues to get some information about hydroclimate change in the subsurface compared with what we see on the surface from our lake records. Finally, we visited the upper catchment of the Wimmera River in a first search for deposits of windblown dust to the region before heading back to Melbourne. And here are a couple of impressions of the city of Melbourne. This is the bridge and the city skyline of Melbourne. The Earth Sciences Department of the University of Melbourne, which was our main collaboration partner for this trip, and the Yarra River. More of the skyline of Melbourne. Flinders Street Station. Albert Park Lake.